Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by Khaki. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
I ran across an article in the New York Post. The headline is, Staggering Amount of Time Gen Z Spends Watching TV During Their Workday. Apparently, whoever it is that put this poll together surveyed a bunch of Gen Zers, millennials, Gen Xers, work-from-home people, asking how much time you spend doing various things during the workday. Top of the list was watching TV at, and this is on a per-year basis, 9 days, 19 hours, 39 minutes spent watching TV during the workday.
That's not that much.
Yeah, well, if you do the math, figure 50 work weeks a year, 40 hours per week, that's 2,000 hours per year. So that 9 days, 19 hours, 39 minutes ends up being 12% of the work time. And then they also have other listings here, socializing, playing games, relaxing and thinking. And if you add it all up, for Gen Z, they're claiming a little bit more than 25% of their work day is spent on these other activities. And then they do the same thing for millennials and Gen X. I didn't do the millennials, but the Gen X, if you run the same calculations, it comes out to be just under 20%. And as I'm reading this, it occurs to me that this is a false comparison because they're trying to get at, how much time are you wasting, you Gen Zers, in the workplace. They don't ask how much time people are wasting on things related to being at work. For example, people stop into my office and start talking about things that have nothing to do with work, or you go and get coffee, the canteen, or whatever it is. There's a tremendous amount of time during the workday in the office that's wasted. And I'm sure people have done studies on that. I don't know what it is. But the long and short of it is, I think what the article is attempting to do is to poke at the work from home people, saying that you're wasting time that otherwise belongs to the company, when they really need to take a closer look, I think, to the people who are actually working in the office and ask the same questions of them.
Right. I've said this before on the podcast, especially around March Madness time, to think that people are working 40 hours a week, even though they might be in the office 60 hours a week, is crazy.
Yeah, it is.
They're probably working 15 hours a week. And if you really think it through, years ago, when you and I were children, they used to say, well, by the time you're adults, we'll all have a 20-hour work week. And we don't. But then again, we kind of do.
Yeah, we kind of do, I think.
And who's not included in this? Well, people whose presence is absolutely required. And I'm thinking about, the guy who works at the gas station. He's working every hour he's on the clock by virtue of the fact that he's got to be standing behind the counter. But salaried employees are not working nearly as much as they once, even though they'll self-report that their hours are up.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the interesting things about work from home. I would imagine that people who work from home actually do spend less time actually working as opposed to doing other things, but not any less than they would in the office. And so ultimately, I think we will get to a point, perhaps when Gen Z becomes the upper management in companies, that they say, all right, look, let's stop all of this charade and just say it like it is. We're all working 3 days a week. Let's make it 3 days a week.
Right. And I think the healthy thing would be for, management to say, these are the tasks that must be completed.
Yeah.
We don't care how long it takes you to complete them. And you and I, as professors, know you assign a paper, and some students are going to work on that paper for an hour and get an A, and some students are going to work on that paper for 10 hours and get a D.
Yeah, and how long you worked on it is completely irrelevant to me as the professor.
Completely irrelevant. So, too, is it irrelevant to me as a manager how long it took you to get a task done?
I think there's a problem here in that managers don't understand how to manage work-from-home people. And so the best they can do is say, well, I see that you're in the seat this many hours, therefore you must be productive.
Yeah, look, and the rejoinder is, well, if I knew you were done with that task after an hour, I would have assigned you another task. Yep. And that's a pretty powerful rejoinder.
Sure.
Right? So there are all kinds of ways to look at this, but if you're looking to maximize productivity, you shouldn't be maximizing worker happiness. Not to the point where we're all going to a baseball game every day, but, you take the point. Happy workers are generally productive workers.
In this, I think one of the great things about COVID is it's pushed us to become much more like the Europeans when it comes to work. I see a marked shift with the younger generation. They're less interested in moving up the corporate ladder. They're more interested in earning a paycheck so they can live their lives, period.
I think that's right, but brace yourself for all the complaints that are going to come 15, 20 years down the road. None of those people are going to be making the same amount of money that previous generations would have who had different corporate values, let's say.
Right. They'll be earning the same as the Europeans, just as they work the same as the Europeans.
That's right. And I think that's fine. You can't have it both ways is my only message here.
Yes.
So choose wisely. I want to bring us back to politics, Ant. I want to emphasize that this is not the foolishness of the week. I say that every week lately, it seems, and I hope after the election I can stop saying that. But, and again, this is not the foolishness of the week. We have, did I mention that this is not the foolishness of the week? I want to be emphatic about that this is not the foolishness of the week. Anyway, we have a Minnesota Senate candidate, and I'm just going to tell you up front it's a Republican because you never would have believed that otherwise. I'm generally against tweet dredging. When somebody becomes prominent in the public eye, we go back 10 years in the Twitter history to find every idiotic thing they've ever said. All right. I'm generally against tweet dredging unless your tweet from 2022 said the bad guys won World War II.
Who said that?
And as always, we'll have the story in the show notes for you. It's a gentleman named Royce White, who is a Republican candidate for the Senate in Minnesota. Given that he's a Republican in Minnesota, he's not going to win anyway.
Wow. Yeah, even less so. He seems to not understand who his base is.
Of all the wars in human history that you could have picked, you picked the one in which it's absolutely 100% clear that the bad guys lost.
Yeah.
You could have picked any other war in human history and been on firmer ground than this.
Mm-hmm.
Jack. Where do these people come from? You've got death camps strewn throughout Europe. Death camps. Attempted genocide.
That's just the 6 million that the Nazis killed. You're not counting the 20 million that the Soviets killed.
Well, the Soviets were on the good guys' side, let's not forget.
Yeah, only at the end, though.
Anyway, we move on to the actual foolishness of the week. And I'm going to start us with Marjorie Taylor Greene yet again. When did the Republicans get this crazy?
Bill, this is what happens when you run to the extreme. This is what you get.
I remember when they used to wear nice suits and they used to say rational things. I guess those days are just gone. I guess once Mitt Romney lost, all bets were off, right? When you can't win wearing nice suits and saying rational things, and Mitt Romney, love him or hate him, is a rational human being.
Hmm.
And I think people are finally starting to realize that they missed a hell of an opportunity with that candidacy, that things would have been very different right now had he won back then. But I leave that off to the side because I want to get to this wingnut Marjorie Taylor Greene, who falls in line with Alex Jones of all people, declaring they, whoever they are, can control the weather, explaining that the hurricanes that Florida has been pummeled with are human interventions for some reason. It seems to be that reason is to keep Republicans from voting because apparently there are Republicans where these hurricanes hit. And you would think, all right, she's just an idiot and this isn't going anywhere. And that's where you'd be wrong. A quick scan through my Twitter feed, or am I supposed to call it X? I still can't call it X. My Twitter feed indicates that there are countless people who agree with this, who absolutely believe that this is a government plot of some kind. They don't answer the obvious question, well, why weren't there other hurricanes that were government plots before, when the government was held by the other party's hands?
Well, but on top of that, if we can control the weather, why are you living in a desert? Why isn't it lush and we're growing crops? And why did we send troops into the Middle East? We could have sent a hurricane.
For once, you actually predict perfectly my first two objections. That's exactly right. There could be palm trees. I could have a lawn out here. I don't have a lawn yet. You know what I've got? Rocks on dirt.
Yeah.
That's what I've got. We say to hell with grass because none of us can afford that much water. Well, okay, let's just make a bunch of rainstorms out here. Why can't we do that? Michelle Taylor Greene. Oh, wait, because you're an idiot. That's why. Why aren't we weaponizing hurricanes against our enemies instead of Florida? But, when you've fallen into bed with Alex Jones, there's literally no hope for you. It's so baffling that a Senate candidate who says the good guys lost World War II.
He doesn't make.
He's not the dumbest thing that I saw this week.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. Bryan Caplan joins us this week. Bryan is an economist and author. He's a professor of economics at George Mason, a research fellow at the Mercatus Center, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Bryan authored The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, and what's going to be part of our discussion today, The Case Against Education. Bryan, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure to be here, Antony.
You and I have known each other for some years, at least in passing. One of the things that brought you to my attention recently was a post you made. And what caught my attention about the post is you said that a reporter from the Chronicle of Higher Education contacted you. You answered a bunch of questions and he completely ignored them. But he gave you permission to publish them, and this is the thing I found. And before we get into those, let me underline for our listeners, because this is going to become important. The Chronicle of Higher Education is, I guess you might describe it as the premier, not a journal, but a premier industry publication for higher education.
It's the trade paper.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting that the Chronicle would be asking the questions that we're going to be talking about here and then completely ignoring your answers.
Honestly, I don't read that much into it. Normally, journalists go and get more than they're planning to use. They did find some other critical people, and they have run a bunch of stuff for me in the past. So you can always go and play the victim and say, this is a conspiracy against my greatness. But in this case, I would say probably not.
Maybe so. You know more about this than I do. But what struck me is your statement here, and there's a graph in here. You talk about the political bias in higher education, partisanship. And you list here, and I always knew this at an intuitive level, but the numbers are astounding. The ratio of Democrat to Republican faculty in higher education. It is astounding.
It is. Yeah, so pretty typically in humanities and social sciences at this point at like 25 or 30 to 1. And by the way, so what's striking about this is that if you just go and ask people to place themselves, a lot of professors will actually say moderate. It's like, well, moderate compared to what? Moderate compared to a random American, moderate compared to your peers. What's nice about the DR ratio is that it actually places professors relative to the general U.S. population rather than just fellow professors. So I think it is a very good measure compared to just self-reported, how left are you, where it might be that if most people around you are Marxist, then you say, oh, yeah, actually I'm right-wing because I'm not a Marxist.
Yeah, moderate in higher ed means Democrat.
Yes.
When you get into the categorization, Bryan, what do you do with independents here?
So the answer is they just get thrown out of the sample. It's one where, actually, so if you know the general political science research on independents, true independents are actually really rare. They're maybe only 10% of the population. About a third of people will self-identify as independents, but if you go and look further, it's like, well, which party do you almost always vote for? I would say a majority of independents actually are in fact partisan, but they just don't like to admit it. And it's really only like 10% of people that are genuinely Switzerland.
Right. So walk us through the data as you see it.
Right. So just to be clear, I'm getting a lot of this from my colleague Dan Klein, who's the world expert. And in a way, if you just want to get data work, I would talk to him because he knows more than me. But main things to understand are that for as long as we've had data, there has been a high Democratic to Republican ratio, again, especially in humanities and social sciences, but it's just been going up and up and up. And there are some fields like anthropology or sociology where in a sample, you'll just see that there are 0 Republicans. So it's actually an infinite ratio. It's like 100 Democrats, 0 Republicans, that kind of thing. And then when you look at other fields that aren't quite as biased, still it's normal to be something like 20, 25, 30 to 1, even 40 to 1. Economics, which is the one that's most interesting to me, and here I do know the data better. In 1996, there was a major survey that found that the Democratic-Republican ratio for economists was 3 to 2. But now it's at more like 9 to 2. And furthermore, if you look at economists under the age of 40, then it looks very much like other social sciences or humanities, where it's more like 20 to 1. So like the honest truth is that the free market economist is basically going extinct right before our eyes.
The curiosity here is that all of these social science disciplines are the very people who keep telling us that we have to have more diversity.
Well, as I think you know, Antony, it's not an abstract diversity that they crave. Rather, it really is a very specific special pleading for groups that they are ultra sympathetic to and considered to have some kind of special status. But when people say I want more diversity, what they really mean is I want more diversity of the kind that I like, and the other stuff, who cares?
Before you got on, James and I were talking about this graph. Oh, and by the way, we'll put a copy of this in the show notes. None of the departments lean Republican. The one that comes closest to 1-to-1 is engineering. It's 1.6 Democrats per Republican. But we were saying before you got on that if this were anything else, 20 to 1, 20 men for every woman in higher education, or 20 whites for every black in higher education, people would be losing their minds.
And especially if you remember that in the general population, Democrats and Republicans are about equally common. So even now, there are still plenty of disciplines in STEM where they probably do have like 20 whites for every black. But remember, the base rate for blacks is 1 person in 7 anyway. So it's not actually that far. But this one is the thing that you need to understand, which I think you actually already do understand, but you just want me to spell it out, is that the people that actually complain about this kind of thing are themselves generally very left-wing, and they only care about the kind of diversity that matters to them. And the other stuff, it's just not relevant.
You said something to the effect of, it was a beautiful quote, that the leftist academics feel threatened if they do not have complete control of the university?
Yes. Yeah, so you'll see things like people getting really upset about Koch's giving $1 million to a university and like, what is this going to do to the political balance of our university, the corruption of the system? You've already got 98% of what's going on and you're complaining about this. So yeah, I think to get inside their head, you have to think about it as this is our domain. You are not allowed to be here unless you agree with our philosophy. And any hint of anything else is highly objectionable. It's basically like the same feeling of an extreme nationalist when one illegal immigrant gets to the country. It's like, well, it's like 1 person out of 1 million. Who cares? Like, well, this is our country. You can't just have that blasé attitude. And similarly, if there is one right-wing think tank on the university campus, even though there's 30 others that are the opposite, still the normal academic reaction, again, specifically humanities and social sciences, which are the politicized disciplines, is to flip out and say, look at this heinous violation. There is this whole work on the psychology of the sacred. A big part of it is that when things are sacred, people don't want to go and do statistical averages and say, well, it's like 98% fine. What's the big deal? Instead, it's like there's one cockroach on the Thanksgiving table, and that one cockroach ruins the entire holiday. That's more of what's going on.
It's interesting, too, because we started with old-time liberals, right? And their idea was that just about everybody should have a seat at the table and let's talk about it. And somehow 60s radicals took over. They took over hiring, and they took over departments, and it just got worse from there. And it's as if somebody who leans right has almost no chance of getting a job in the academy at this point.
Yeah, in a way, I think you are too charitable to the old left. I think that there are some differences, but still, like, they were never concerned about political balance. They were never concerned about religious balance. Rather, they just didn't care as much about checking the usual boxes of we need to have a certain number of women, certain number of blacks, certain number of Hispanics, certain number of Muslims. So, I mean, I don't think there has been a radical transformation of the left so much as a radicalization of a view that was always there.
What's your intuition about students? I'll give you mine and then chime in. I got the sense when I would teach free market principles to general business majors, there were always one or two that thought I was a crazy person. They don't want to hear this and they're offended. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority, I found it was as if there was a collective sigh of relief that I'm actually telling them something that they haven't heard, or intuitively they feel that it isn't the usual indoctrination that they're getting elsewhere.
I wish I was teaching your students. I would say that the vast majority of students are just totally apathetic and couldn't care less about anything. They're just trying to get their grades and live their lives. Insofar as they care, I'd say that students lean very left, but not as left as the faculty. When people say that academia is like a madrasa, where there's a pile of dogma that is like everybody had better believe it, and if you doubt it, you better go and not say anything too strongly against it. Just say, well, like that's sort of the strongest you can do. Out of students, yeah, I say like vast majority are just apathetic and apolitical. Insofar as they care, they lean left, but just not as much as the faculty, which honestly, to lean more left than the faculty would be really hard.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how farther left you can go.
Yeah.
I think it would be impossible.
Yes.
But now this sort of thing, and this came to a head when I was teaching in a state school in Utah. But these sorts of things, I think, really cause a problem in state schools, right? Where the taxpayers are funding something that if they knew about, they would be horrified, absolutely horrified. How do you begin to address this?
I mean, honestly, I would say the problem is when taxpayers don't know. And the good thing is when they find out and start doing something about it. So yes, so right now in red states, finally, almost for the first time I've ever seen in my life, there is some realization of these are people that are extremely ideologically biased, that do not respect free speech, that do not care to have a dialogue. Whenever they say they want a dialogue, it means they talk and other people have to listen. And then there's some moderate efforts in red states to say, well, if that's all that it's going to be, why don't we go and cut their funding or start second guessing them, or at least say, wait a second, we're not going to go and let you require classes where people have to pretend to agree with you in order to get their degree. We're not going to fund departments that seem they are totally politicized and are not really interested in having a curious exploration of the world. I mean, honestly, I say still, vast majority of the country, the general view is they're the experts, let them do whatever they want. And it's only in a few red states like Texas and Florida where there's at least some realization of they don't really deserve to be trusted. They are not here to go and have a fair, reasonable conversation. They're just here to try to brainwash people and talk amongst themselves. And by the way, so I have talked to people say that I'm being very unfair to them. And it's like, do I think that left-wing professors sit around among each other and say, oh, great, another chance to brainwash people? Yeah, probably not. I think it's more that they are so isolated from the rest of society that what to them seems like a fair discussion is brainwashing. It's just like the narrowest range of opinion is all they can really think about talking about. And anything outside of that, they're like, well, are there people who think that? It's like, oh, yes, it's actually the majority view. You're just so lost in your own world that you don't know about it. I mean, and by the way, like I have a lot of extremely contrary views, but I know when my views are unpopular because I look at public opinion and I say, oh, yeah, hardly anybody agrees with me. I'm not under any illusion that I speak for normal people. And like these guys, they did not have that level of self-awareness. If they did, it wouldn't be as bad.
See, I think you're being awfully generous. I wouldn't characterize it as an absence of self-awareness, but an absence of humility.
The two things are very similar, are they not?
These are a bunch of people who have titles and high educations, and everyone else out there says, oh, clearly you're the intellectual. And that can very easily go to your head to the extent that if they are aware that the majority disagree with them, I'm sure in their minds it's just because, well, the majority are simply wrong.
Mm-hmm. Another part of this is that the vast majority of faculties are being produced by like 3 major universities.
Mm-hmm. Somewhat overstated, but yeah, top 20 anyway.
Whatever the point of view is at those places, and I'm thinking specifically of Harvard and Princeton, boy, whatever the point of view is there, that's the point of view that's going to keep ringing.
Yes. I mean, of course, you need to remember that each department is different or each field is different. So what you're being taught in Harvard Econ is pretty different from what you're being taught in Harvard Sociology. But yeah, academia is one of the most hierarchical fields in the world. It is one where it's very hard to rise above your credential. Normally, the first job you get out of academia is the best job you'll ever have. You can only go down. The top schools do produce a very large share of the faculty who then wind up teaching at lower ranked places.
I notice that faculty have this tendency to, and I should say this tendency only goes in one direction, that you'll have people in the theology departments, the sociology departments, the English departments holding forth on economics. Mm-hmm. But you won't get economists holding forth on, 15th century literature, for example. Our colleague Phil Magnus said that Karl Marx is one of the most widely read economists across higher education, although he's almost never read in economics departments. It's always outside.
He's read in almost every English department in the United States, and yet he didn't write in English.
Oh.
It boggles the mind.
Yeah. Here's the thing is that people who are especially in humanities, they're not going to read an econ textbook. It's just boring to them. It's very analytical, pretty mathematical. They're much more likely to go and read 19th century literary figures that presented themselves as economists, but would not really be very well respected today. Honestly, I would say that's among the least of their sins. Sometimes you can go and read older people and they actually, though not using modern language, have something very useful to say. And on the other hand, there's plenty of people who are at the cutting edge of their field who, when you really read through it, it's like, you're not even talking about the real world, are you? This is all a model. You don't really even care about the real world. One of the best pieces that my friend Dan Klein, who I was mentioning earlier as an expert on the politics of academia, but he published a great paper on the Journal of Economic Theory, where the gist of it was most papers in the Journal of Economic Theory never mention a fact. No facts are mentioned. So it's a theory without even pretending to try to explain any facts. And it's a whole journal like that. He actually got the editor of the journal to go and say, well, my journal is actually quite good. I don't see why I need to mention any facts. There's plenty of corruption to go around in academia. But yes, the main reason why someone like Marx would be so popular is precisely because he is so radically left-wing and tells people what they want to hear.
Where do you see this going? We're already seeing that the higher ed is almost entirely leftist. I would imagine you would agree. I have no problem with leftists in academia. What I would like for quality education, we should have balance, and we're nowhere near that. And given that the faculty themselves are the ones who hire and then tenure subsequent faculty, is there any way to pull back from this?
Right. I think the word you're looking for is monoculture.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think the general pattern is that it's just getting worse. The younger people are even more left-wing than the older people, even more dogmatic, even more hostile to actually having any kind of social relations. People disagree. The main sign of hope, I would say, is that we are polarizing at the state level. Partly as a result of COVID, federalism has actually had a big revival in the United States. You can see during COVID that you had places that almost totally reopened in a few weeks and places that stayed locked down for 2 years. That whole range happened in the United States. We're seeing the same thing for school choice. We have a lot of states where they are doubling down and trying to actually close charter schools, but there's other ones that are switching to universal school choice. Similarly, for academia, we got a few states like Texas and Florida where they're at least trying to go and say, we're going to get rid of mandatory political brainwashing. The DEI departments, we're going to go and try to create some new intellectual centers that are going to be able to offer something different. So that's happening at one end. And at the other end, you have most of the country is just doubling down on DEI and diversity statements with maybe a little bit of pushback. Even that's not clear. The only thing that makes me hopeful is federalism, which is at least leading to a greater divergence. As to whether that's going to be enough to actually lead to things getting absolutely better in those red states, like 30%.
What do you think the odds are that there'll be a market response whereby predominantly Republican faculties are hired at new schools founded for exactly the purpose?
Yeah, I put that real low. That would be more than a couple % of the students. The main point of my book, The Case Against Education, is that students are basically looking for a stamp on the forehead. They don't really care much about learning. The real function of school, it's a passport to the real training that happens on the job. The share of students that are actually so political and also in strong disagreement with the usual thing It's just a tiny number of people. So you do have the University of Austin, which is a startup, and they've got a small number of students, but I don't think that there's really much demand for it. It's a big country, so maybe there's enough to have a few schools, but will it even be 5% of the student body? No. And those schools are going to be low prestige. So basically, they're going to be getting people that are willing to take a hit to prestige in order to get something different. More power to them, but that is just going to be very unusual. In a way, I'd say the more likely scenario for things improving is that the fall in meritocracy at top schools is going to be so egregious that they're actually going to spoil their name brand, and then top employers are going to say, yeah, Harvard grads aren't really very good anymore. Things like schools just completely getting rid of test scores, test optional. There has been a return, so a bunch of schools are going back to at least requiring testing while still not really admitting just on testing. On top of that, even at places like Harvard, until recently, the issue was massive racial discrimination against whites and Asians. So then employers can say, well, if you're white or Asian, you still got into Harvard, you're probably awesome. So there is some of that going on. But yeah, I don't see much pushback because the main thing people are going for is prestige anyway. And on top of it, there's just the massive government subsidies. If you just look at the difference between private school tuition and public school tuition, it gives you a feel for what all of the subsidies that are happening. When you just take a look at the official state subsidy, I think that's a misleadingly low estimate. And the best way to measure how much government support our school's getting really is just gap between public and private school tuition.
Which is, if I'm remembering the numbers now, it's 100%, right? 20,000 circa for state and 40,000 for private.
You need to look at the after subsidy or the net tuition.
Net tuition, okay, yeah.
Rather than list tuition. So yeah, rich schools tend to be actually giving bigger discounts than poorer schools. 2-to-1 still seems totally reasonable. Maybe even more. Maybe more like 3-to-1, all things considered.
It's something that has never occurred to me, and I don't know why it's never occurred to me until we're just having this conversation, given that I spent my entire career in higher ed.
If you're not confused, you don't understand what's going on, Antony. It's a really complicated system.
Well, but that is that these are nonprofit institutions.
Indeed.
Nonprofit institutions have their hands tied to at least some extent when it comes to making political statements.
Do they, though? I haven't noticed it. So there are generally state rules about state employees, quasi-state employees using their jobs to promote political views. So if you use the public school website to go and push a party, then usually there are state laws against that. But other than that, there's really very little limitation. And in fact, even public universities until the Hamas attack, it was totally normal for not just private, but public universities to go and make stupid, ill-informed statements about almost every major public event that's happening. You see the news and then wait for your inbox for the university president to tell everybody what right-thinking people at our university think. Which brings me to my favorite hot take, which is, Hamas has actually did a lot to save free speech on American universities indirectly, because by virtue of having that horrible terrorist attack, they got a whole bunch of people on the usual woke side standing up for them. And then the question is, all right, they're part of the woke coalition, but they don't speak for everybody. In fact, they don't speak for even the normal woke person. And there are a lot of Jews in the woke coalition. And it's like, gee, we can't go and publicly say the pro-Hamas protesters are wrong because they're on our side. But we can't say they're right because that would be psychotic.
Huh.
Then the university sat there saying, gee, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? It's like free speech and political neutrality, which we've always believed in, of course. So that is, through a total coincidence, is how Hamas has really changed the tenor of U.S. universities. The DEI office at my school has pretty much been completely silent for a year.
Huh.
Imagine that.
Because it's like, we aren't going to speak out against the pro-Hamas people. Definitely not. They're part of our team. But we're not going to say they're right either. And we're not going to go against the Jews. And so we're just going to shut up.
Yeah.
And here's the thing is, the shutting up has actually been quite broad, because they do realize if we go and opine on something else, it's like, well, why are you opening up your mouth on this issue but not Palestine? And it's, oh, gee, we better just completely shut up. I'm not at Penn. So I'm trying to get the hashtag everyone disparage Penn going, but Every other school that I know of, the DEI people are just being uncharacteristically mute because they feel the stress of the situation and they don't want to take a side given what's going on. And if they can't take a side on that, they don't want to take a side on anything. Won't last, but I'll take what I can get.
Bryan, thank you for joining us. Do you want to take a few minutes to plug your books, your podcast, your blog?
Plug it all.
Absolutely. I never turn down an opportunity to self-promote, which, by the way, is a big difference between me and almost all professors. So you can sit around and talk about all these left-wing professors brainwashing their students. Most of them make no effort to engage with a broader audience. They just publish a few articles in some journals nobody reads and then share their opinions with some students who barely care. So that is a big difference between me and them. Like, I'm always promoting.
Right.
Like, I figure if it's worth writing a book, it's worth selling the book. Like what's wrong with these people? It is kind of odd, like that you would write a whole book and then not do podcasts, not try to talk to media, not go and have a blog promoting it. So I am a tireless self-promoter. I'm up to 11 books. Let's see. So you already mentioned a few of them. Myth of the Rational Voter. Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids is my one book that has actually improved the world noticeably because it has convinced hundreds of people to have additional kids, which using Economist's usual measure is adding billions of dollars of value to the world. So
Yeah.
I didn't get the billions, but it's like, all right, well, I made some billions that were given as a gift to some people that otherwise wouldn't have gotten to exist. So proud of that. Case Against Education you mentioned. I've also done 2 nonfiction graphic novels, one on immigration called Open Borders, and the other new one on housing regulation called Build, Baby, Build. My pitch on Build, Baby, Build, it is the most fascinating book ever written about housing regulation.
Huh.
Well,
Yeah, and I'll say also the most fascinating book that ever will be written on housing regulation. I'm just going to stick my neck out because it is a graphic novel. It's one that a lot of people can read and enjoy. I really try to go with imaginative visuals and just suck the reader in. This is the kind of thing I think about a lot. How can I reach a broader audience? How can I make this interesting to someone that normally wouldn't read an academic book?
Bryan, the next 2 things I'm going to read are those 2 books.
Yeah.
All right, awesome.
I can't wait to see them.
There's a couple other economists that have done graphic novels, and again, I'm just going to say, like, mine are way better. I really put a lot of effort into the visuals. I got fantastic artists. They're full color. I tried to go and not just use the laziest visual. I put a lot of thought into what visual would really capture this in a deep way, which is a visual that you can come back to, which is memorable. So that's a big thing that I'm into. You know, those are books that really you can even give to 5-year-olds and they'll get something out of. So when I was working on Open Borders, my 5-year-old daughter was leaning over my shoulder reading as I was working. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've got something here. Like a 5-year-old wants to read what I have to say. And yet also people who are research specialists in the field can still read it and say, this is not just accurate. It tells me something that I didn't already know.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.